Welcome to everybody watching on YouTube as well. And welcome to another session of Building Web Applications with Neo4j and Typescript. So it's been a while since I did my last stream. So I thought I'd spend some time, instead of live coding, going through some of the changes I've made to the project in the meanwhile. And to do that, I'll go through the context of another project. So as always, all of the code is available on GitHub. So if you want to look back on everything that we've done so far with the client Neoflix, then you can go to github.com/adam-cowley/twitch-project. And all of the code is there for you. You can clone it. If you have any comments, any suggestions, if there's any features you'd like to see, then feel free to issue a pull request. Cool. So a few days ago, someone posted on our internal Slack channels about an application called the real world application. So if you go to realworld.io, it will redirect you to this repository. And so this is described as the mother of all demo apps. So you may have previously looked at the difference between two apps. Or two programming languages using the to-do MVC model. But this one aims to be more of a comprehensive example essentially it's a real world demo. So it's a clone of medium.com. And if you take a look through the repo, so it shows you the different front ends and back ends. So the idea of the repository is it's got many front ends and back ends that work together. So if you're building a front end, you can point it straight towards this conduit API. And if you're trying to build a back end, then it gives you the specifications that you can build. So the idea being that every single application that gets built should work front end and back end with any of the other examples. So for example, you could take the React and Redux example and then pair that with Node and Express backend, and then everything would work. So it's got, so I think it's 29 front ends at the moment, plus more in works in progress. And then there are over 30 back ends as well. So there's plenty of interesting things to look at. So it goes all the way from the most popular front end, so things like React, Angular, and Vue, and then all the way down to things like Riot and then Christmas, which I've never heard of. And in terms of the back ends, the most popular one so far, so everything is ordered by the number of stars, number of forks. So Node Express is the biggest one at the moment, and then it goes all the way down to Spincast, which again I've never heard of before. So looking through this repository, I saw that there was a Nest.js example, but this one used TypeORM and Prisma, and so under the hood this uses MySQL. And I thought, no, I can't really stand for that. I need to do a Neo4j example of this. So one of the problems that we've had so far in terms of the Neoflix example is that we've now got to the point where we're reading from the database and we're writing back to the database as well. But we, in order to progress that any further, then we'll have to basically integrate with some sort of front end so we can see the differences. So what this real world example will do is it allow us to run to create a backend which we can then hook a UI into, and then everyone can see exactly what is going on there. So in terms of developing a backend in the repository, it's they encourage you to create a new stack, so you can come up with whatever acronym you like. I've not come up with one so far, so we're just going to be the NN stack, I guess. So it's going to be Neo4j and Next.js with Typescript in there as well. And so in terms of creating new framework, they provide you with a spec, so it guides you through the process of being able to create one of these. So, for example, for the front end, you can either point your front end to this API, and everything will be good to go. But for the back end, they provide an API spec. So there's also a Postman Collection. So what I've been doing so far is I've been working through the Postman Collection to make sure that the tests there pass. So if anyone does know, Postman is a UI that allows you to mimic API requests. Also, in terms of the API, so it's a basic REST API. So there's a run API test script that you can run the test from this Postman collection through. There's also a Swagger file if you want to develop with Swagger as well. So, for example, we have the different payloads which are outlined here. So we have the user, the profile. So one of the differences between this API and the Neo4j one is that everything comes in its own object inside the payload. So where everything was, for example, on the list of movies, you had basically a list of just a list of objects. Now we've got an object with an object, which would then have a list inside there as well. So in terms of the collection, so for the Postman collection, so basically this gives you a file that you can download and then you can import into Postman. Once you import it in, you'll get a collection that looks a little bit like this. And the collection is essentially just a set of folders, and then inside those folders there are different tests inside there. So my plan for yesterday was to build a. Sorry, they decided to cut the grass right when I'm doing my stream, which is great. So yeah, so my plan yesterday was basically to do a little bit of research into the UI, and then build an application during the live stream, so we can start off at the top of the test and then work our way down. So I got a little bit carried away, and then I basically ended up at the end building most of the tests. So there's still a few tests there to do. So in terms of the profiles and tags, so the rest are working. So what I do is I'll walk through the code that I've written so far, look at the different classes and modules and services that I've created, and then also, if we have time, I'll go through and I'll develop the rest of the tests. So in terms of the integration with Nest, so one of the things I did when I was working yesterday is I took all of the useful code from the Neo4j API and then put it into a module that we can use in Nest. So if you want to go through from scratch and then you want to build your own Neo4j services and things like that, then you can go here and you can either follow the series or you can clone the code and you can go from there. Essentially, what I've done is I've taken the everything inside this Neo4j folder. I reorganized it a little bit and then put it into a package. So if you don't want to build from scratch, then you can basically just run npm install with Nest Neo4j. You register the module, so the same way that we did inside Neo4j, and then you could use the service to then interact with Neo4j. So in terms of the application itself, so what I did is I started off with a basic example. So I used the Nest command to generate a new project. So Nest new, and then Nest Neo4j real world example. And then I built everything from there, basically. So the first thing I did is I used the command line to install Nest Neo4j. So it's that one there, so 0.1.1. So all I did for there is just npm install and then save Nest Neo4j. And then that essentially, instead of having the files locally, they now come from a package. So in the app module, what I then did is I used the for root async method to register the Neo4j module. And then again, so what that does is it takes the config module. So the dynamic module takes the config module, injects the Neo4j, injects the config service into this factory function, and then the factory function then returns a Neo4j config. So that includes the scheme, the host, the port, username, password, and then the default database as well. So all that information is pulled from the M file. So it's basically that information there. And then that basically gives us a Neo4j service that we can then inject into our classes. So I then created a user module. So again, using Nest generate, in this case, module and then user. And then basically just registered the same sort of authentication that we use inside Neoflix is used here. So it's using Passport, it's using JWT tokens. So with all of the tests, so all of these gave a really good indication and a good guide point of what we need to do to implement this. So basically, you see, so I'd start from top to bottom. So the first one I did was the register route. So this takes so it takes this user object, and then inside the user has the user information. So all of these inside the two braces, that is an environment variable. So I set up an environment here, and then I set details there. So the API URL is localhost 3000, so it's the default for Nest. The email address, adam@neo4j.com, so that's the email that we used to sign the user up. The password, and then the username, and then the token basically gets filled in for us. As part of the login process, as part of the test, there is a line that I've added to the bottom that basically says to store the token as user.token. And then that's used throughout the rest of the request. So for example, in the inside the get user request, I can use the token, and then that then gets passed through. So the authentication is pretty much the same. I mean, the files are in a slightly different place.